just want to ask if anybody had any questions on the last lecture. I know we kind of went over a lot with all those different data structures and data types in JavaScript with objects. But yeah, I would just encourage you guys to keep practicing and keep working through problems with that involve code, JavaScript, and working with objects, working with arrays, working with strings and numbers, and yeah, it'll eventually start clicking. We'll have also a more all-encompassing project on the last day where we'll give you guys the tools needed to actually build a website using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And so working through that project will also be really good practice as well. So if there are no questions, today's lecture is going to be pretty short. And then you guys will get a chance to do the exercises. I'll unlock the workshop after this lecture. But today's lecture is going to be on conditionals, so if statements, and also on debugging. So debugging is a crucial aspect of coding. And it is always useful to, when you see an error, to be able to figure out what's going wrong with it, with the program. So yeah, if you guys have, I can give you guys an example here. Where I'll just open up a REPL, and yeah, if I try to, if I try to access something that doesn't exist yet, so if I haven't defined this function yet, and I just try to do I try to run this code, it'll break, it'll say reference error, get max is not defined. And it really helps. We're always going to run into errors no matter what stage of coding we're at. And so it really helps to figure out, or at least get a handle on what may be causing these errors. So first off, a lot of times it's really helpful to look at the stack trace to see what line the error is coming from. And we can see that here. This error is at only odds line 11. So the first number is what line, and then this second number is kind of like columns. Or, this is the y-axis and this is the x-axis unit. And so yeah, it tells us right here that get max is not defined, which means we're trying to access a variable that we haven't declared yet. And so that's one type of error you can get. So now when we actually define that function first and then call it, now we won't get that error anymore. Similarly, if we try to, create a number, 50 states, and then we try to do something like numStates.length. That should also give an error. Oh, whoa. Maybe it does have a length property. Let me see, push or something. This shouldn't work. Yeah, so again, it'll say a given error is not a function. And yeah, there's all sorts of different errors. I can't recall every single type off the top of my head, but so there's some generally good principles that you can follow to start to debug an error. So let's say, and console logs is always a really helpful tool to help debug. So if we had a function called, let's see what it could do, like transform data or something, and it was supposed to transform a, let's see what we want this to do. Let's say, all right, so we start off with a, me try and think what we can do to convert things. So we have an item, and it consists of a name, and we'll just call this like an iPhone 7 or iPhone, and then we'll just call it version 7, and then we'll say like quantity is like 500, and then yeah, that'll be it for now. And that's what we're gonna initially start out with, and then we're just gonna transform this item with this function. And so we'll say, you know, var new var converted item equals label is, or full name is iPhone 7, and the what else is the, or iPhone 7, and then we'll say, you know, or we'll just say item dot name plus, or item dot version. And then I'm basically trying to show you guys like a series of steps that happens, and then an error happens in one of those steps. Like, how do we like debug and figure out what the error is? So let's just say there's like 2 steps. So like final item equals, and then we have, you know, quantity is item dot quantity, and then we have color is like white or something, and then the final item is final name is item converted item dot full name plus, and I'm just concatenating strings right now, plus converted item dot color, and then price is converted item dot price, and I know that doesn't exist, so that'll give us an error, and then we're gonna return the final item. So this is basically like a function, and this will be something that will be commonly done, is like we take data from something from some place, and then we like add a bunch of things to it or remove a bunch of things from it, so that we display, you know, that we know, so that we know what to display. Because if you go to like Amazon and then you see like, you know, this t-shirt example I'm using, so the data that we see here could be like combined from all these different sources. Like, you know, we take the t-shirt from a database, and then we take like you know, all of this data could live in different places. Like the t-shirt name and all of the associated like properties could be in one table, and then that could be combined with data from another table about that t-shirt. And then, you know, it's something that is pretty commonly done, is to like transform data and add to things and subtract things, because there might be a lot more data about this that we don't see on here. And so if we don't need to see it on the UI, then we don't really need to even like include it when we pull it from the database or whatever source that we're pulling it from. So we only really, you know, this might be all the data plus more data from different sources. This might be data from this, this particular item in the database, but like subtracted information, because maybe we don't need to see like the SKU number, and like we don't need to know how many there are, because Amazon knows that, but we don't need to know that, like exactly how many quantity it is, or like the price that they bought it for. They probably store all this data that we don't even need. So maybe it gets transformed on the way to the client, so to strip that data. So here we have this function. We're going to transform this data, and then when we try to run it and we pass item to it. So what we're doing right now is we have a function and we're creating it with a name. It takes a parameter, and then we're doing squiggly brackets in order to show where the function's starting and where it's ending. And then we create a bunch of variables inside here, and then we finally return a final item. And what we return from a function is like what the value of that function becomes when we invoke that function. So right now I could do something like var final item equals this, because when I call this function, it becomes this value that we return from the function. So now I'm gonna run it, and wait, I guess this actually does, it'll be undefined. So let me try and make this throw an error. Metadata is another object that has, the reason why it's not breaking, even though converted item doesn't have a price, is because when I do this, it'll be undefined. And so technically undefined is a proper value. So it could still, price could still be undefined, because when you're trying to access a property that doesn't exist, it'll be automatically undefined. So I need to like access a nested property somehow. I create so many errors when I don't try to, but when I actually try to make an error, all of a sudden it's hard to make an error. Let's see, metadata, and then for some reason this metadata just happens to be like unknown. It happens to be like a string, and so now maybe this should converted item dot metadata dot price. This should go in there. Dang. How is this not an error? Okay, so I'm confused why it's not even throwing an error. So that's an opportunity to debug. I'm like trying to debug why the error is not even being thrown. So basically what I could do right here is I could say, what does my final item look like? Because I have no idea what the intermediate values are, because I have this item here, and then I do some transformation logic here, but what's the intermediate value? Like, I don't know what it fully looks like at each step. So I can use console.log, and this is something that is a really basic way. There's more advanced ways like using the debugger and things like that, but initially when you start coding, I think console logs become your best friend, because they're sort of x-raying the function. So a bunch of stuff's happening when you call this function that we don't really know what's going on, except we know this final output. But when we use console logs, we're able to see the internals of what's happening in the function. And so we could do something like converted item, and we can actually see what the converted item is. And then we could also do like final item. And we could all see what the final item is, so that now we see, I need to change this to final item. Yeah, so now we have the converted item is full name iPhone 7, quantity is 500, color is white, metadata is unknown. And the final item is iPhone 7 white, and the price is undefined. So when I actually try to access the price of the metadata, it's undefined, which is weird because it's a string, and I don't know why you can access a property of that doesn't even exist on a number, which is really quite interesting. Okay, so now it breaks. So it says, cannot read property price of undefined. And so what helps is that, like, at least we know in this case the intermediate value that we're pulling data from is this converted item. So when I console log, I can see that intermediate value, and then it breaks. So I know we're good up to here at least. And then something here is messed up. And obviously you could tell that with the line, like figuring out what line the error is happening at. But a lot of times this isn't fully accurate because of the complex nature of the program. Sometimes this number output isn't even where the actual error is happening from. And also sometimes the error is happening in some library, some package that someone else wrote. And so we don't necessarily even have access to like see where the error is happening. So sometimes it helps to figure out where in the code, like if you know in general vaguely like where the error might be, throw some console logs, and then at least you'll know up to what point the code was successful. And then we know that this isn't being logged and this is logged, so that means that something's wrong here. It's a really crude way to debug, but to be honest, I still use it and it works. The debugger is something that is also useful, but I think that's more of a little more of an advanced topic. But for now, throwing console logs is crucial to figuring out what these intermediate values are in the function and where the function may have gone wrong. So yeah, these errors, it's always helpful to also Google whenever you get an error, to Google what type of error you're getting, and chances are somebody else may have come across that error as well. So Google is your best friend. And yeah, there are, some basic steps that we can take to make sure that the errors are mitigated, and that's closing all your brackets, your braces, parentheses, making sure you have all your commas. So this is a really common one in objects where you're creating an object and you just forget a comma, and now it should give an error. Yeah, right here, unexpected identifier. That just means like you're missing a comma. Every property should be separated by a comma. Same thing with arrays. If you have a list of the seasons, right? And then you forget a comma here. Oh, well, that won't break. Oh, well, yeah, it will break because you have the wrong. I mean, it won't break if you just turn that into one string, Winterfall. But you guys get the idea, like commas. If you're missing, semicolons are pretty optional for the most part. Like you can do them, you don't have to do them, but it's a more debatable, topic where people might say, it gives you closure, like knowing that like that line is finished. So it could be a stylistic preference, but for the most part, other than small minority of cases, this is completely unnecessary. But I like to put them, and usually in editors, they'll automatically be put in so that you don't have to think about it and that it's consistent throughout. But when you're just starting out, a lot of these autocompletes, we have to kind of be able to handle that ourselves. Yeah, so reference errors are another really common one, and that's kind of like what we just mentioned, where I try to access something, console log item 1. Like, it doesn't exist in this scope. So item 1 hasn't been defined. That's a reference error. And so we have to define it first before we reference it. That's a common error. Spelling, yeah, it's like if you misspelled it, if this was item phone item, but then you accidentally misspelled phone, then it'll break. So spelling is something that we have to always keep in mind. And when they talk about scope, that means that when you have a function that creates a scope, let's just have a sum function, and that creates a scope. So everything inside of this is no longer accessible outside of it. So if I do, let's see, let first, or var first number equals 0, or equals a, var second number equals b, return first number plus second number, right? I don't have access to first number outside of the function because it's inside this function, and so we no longer have access to it. So yeah, this should throw an error. First number is not defined because it is defined in here, but outside of it we don't have access to it. So that's why we have a reference error. All right, so let's get into some conditional statements. So they control logic and the flow of our programs, and so they're kind of like forks in the road where we can decide to go left or go right, go up or down, run this code or that code. And so how we do this is we use if-else statements. Yeah, these statements are pretty contrived because if 9 is greater than 8 is always going to be true. So it'll always log this is true. But so it'll never get to the else statement. But usually when we have if else, when that code gets to that point, usually it can either go into one or the other. And whatever's in the parentheses has to evaluate to either true or false. So it has to be an expression, essentially an assertion that will be casted to either a true or false value. So here, whatever we put in here will essentially become either true or false. It doesn't have to be true or false exactly, but it has to be a statement or an assertion that when it gets evaluated, evaluates either to true or false. So yeah, if number is greater than 8, it'll log there. If it's greater than 6, it'll log here. And if it's none of those conditions, it'll finally go into the else statement. So basically what this is saying that in the first if that statement is not met, then you go into this else if, and that means that this statement was not met. So that means that the number was less than or equal to 8 by default, because the inverse is true. Like if this statement is not true, then the inverse is true by default. It's like just logic stuff. And yeah, that means it'll come here to this code, run this else if, and then when it finally gets here, that means that it's not greater than 8 and it's not greater than 6, which means it's less than or equal to 6. not that we have to explicitly state that anymore, because by virtue of us putting this else, it's like a final catch-all. It's like saying like it's the inverse of everything that came before it. So right here, it's basically in the else if it's saying that the number is greater than 6, or if it's not true, then it's going to evaluate to this conditional again. And yeah, we can get as complex as or as long as we want, like if something, else if something else, else if something else, else if something else. But then finally, we always need to put that else, or we don't always need to, but it's really helpful to have the catch-all default, like none of these are true, so we're gonna do this. So let's go through an example. So say we have a function that will greet someone, and it'll greet this person, and if the person dot name, so there's a couple things that to know about if statements. So whatever we put inside of it will become true or false. And so person dot name is technically, so let's say person is just an empty object that doesn't have a name property, right? Person is just an empty object. That means person dot name will be undefined because we haven't set it, it doesn't exist. And if something doesn't exist yet, then we denote that value by saying it's undefined, versus like null, which means that it actually just is missing a value. Undefined means it hasn't been declared yet. So this undefined, when we actually put it into the if, it'll become false because null, undefined, 0, and empty string, they all become false inside of an if statement because they get casted to be a falsy value. Or false itself also becomes, they all equal to false. Everything else will be casted to true by default. So here I'm going to say if the person dot name, it's basically saying like if the person has a name property at all, then I'll just log them by their name. Hello plus person dot name. And then here I could say else console log hello there, if I don't know their name or something. And so here I could do greet, and then the person I'll put as an empty object. So technically it should go into this branch. So now I'm running it. It goes to log hello there because this person.name is undefined since we're passing in an empty object into this function. And so person.name is undefined. And then we are essentially going into this else statement. Now, there's many options. Like, you don't have to even put an else statement here. You could just say, oh, if the person.name, if it has a name, then log it. And then else is kind of like a given, where, even if you don't have it, it'll still run this code. Like, its code will run top down, and it'll run these lines, and then it'll still get here. So else is not always necessary, but why it is necessary sometimes is basically if you don't want this. So, if this is true, we want this to run. else if it's not true, we want this to run. So only if this isn't true will this run. Will this else statement run? But if we put it here, then actually it won't work. Sorry, I take that back, because it'll log both of them, because it'll do this and then it'll come here and it'll log this too. So we want to use the else if we don't want this to happen. If this if statement is true, then we mark it in this else and we say like this code will not run if this code runs. So we do this, and then if we actually give it a name, and this name is arbitrary, it could be, you know, then we run this first bit of logic. We could have also said like else if person dot name I mean, technically I don't want to get too complicated here, but we could also say, you know, if person dot name does not exist, by basically saying, oh, if this is undefined. And we use these triple equals here to make an assertion, and that's different from doing one equal sign, because that's assigning it to be undefined. But if we do triple equals, we're asserting that it's undefined, and therefore we're making an assertion that could either be true or false. And so this should work the same way, like else if this, but we kind of don't even need this else if in this case, because by virtue of the fact that this is truthy, that means that if we ever get here, that else if is kind of a given, that, you know, this wasn't true, that's why we came here, which means that the inverse of this is true, which is kind of like what this is explicitly stating. But if you take that out, then that's just implicitly stating it. It's still stating it. So in this case, I would say it's unnecessary to do an else if, but a situation where it is necessary to do an else if is if we had like let's say this was season, and then we say if season equals winter, console log, and then else. Now we want the else if, because there could be a multiple else ifs, right? Because now there could be else if season equals summer. Then we could say hello. Just take out the person for now. And then else if season equals fall. Happy Halloween. And then now we could put an else if season equals winter, but this is kind of verbose and unnecessary, because like by virtue of there being an else here, that means that none of these were true, which kind of by default means that we're in winter. If we feel like this should be limited to only seasons, then we kind of don't need that last else if. And so we could just put an else, which is like your catch-all, which means none of these were true, which by inverse property kind of means that it's spring. So you have choices. I like using an else at the end if I have a bunch of else ifs, because, you know, if I do else if season equals spring, and I don't do an else, that means that if none of these are true, then I'm not gonna do any. I'm not really gonna know what I did, because this is if you just have an if and a bunch of else ifs, then technically the inverse situation of all of these never gets run, never gets run like specifically, or if we put an else, then that means that we know none of these were true and we finally ran this. But if we don't put an else at the end, then that means that we kind of don't know. I mean, we know that the line 14 will run after all of these conditionals are are evaluated. We know that this line will run, but it kind of helps to have the else at the end as like a catch-all. Like if no, in the case that none of these were true, then we will run this final line. It's kind of like a finally statement, but it's not fully necessary. So we have all this conditional, we went over all this conditional logic. Yeah, it's kind of like you can shape the conditionals however you see fit. It's pretty flexible in terms of like how you want to structure it. You can use an if else, you can use, it's a little dangerous to use if without an else, because as I just mentioned before, that means that line of code will run and then the line below it will also run all the time. But if you only want one code to run or the other code, then you always want to use an else so that the one line doesn't run. So we kind of went over this already, but this checks if two values are equal. The exclamation point in the front will assert that the values are not equal. And less than operator will assert if something's less than or equal to, and greater than or equal to. So these are a lot of common operators that are used in if statements to make certain assertions. So now we kind of already went over this, but truthy and falsy values. So I kind of went over the falsy ones, which is undefined, null, zero, empty string, but most other things are truthy, which means that when we evaluate them in an if statement, they become casted to true, the Boolean true. And so using this Boolean is basically casting a value into a Boolean value. So it's saying, hey string, like what's your Boolean value? And if the string is not empty, it'll say my Boolean value is true. If the string is empty, it'll say my Boolean value is false. So that's what happens when you put Boolean and then you give it an argument. It's a function that'll run and it'll take the input and it'll convert that into either a true or false Boolean. So any non-zero number is truthy. Any strings are truthy with any length, so non-empty strings. All arrays are also truthy. All objects are truthy. So these all evaluate to true when we console log them. And as I mentioned before, these are falsy values, and they're empty strings, zero, null, or undefined. So technically, in the if statement, I didn't even use in the first one where I said, if person.name. When I did the person.name thing, so when I say if person.name, I could have done Boolean person.name, but within an if statement, it's almost like you don't need this Boolean because it just evaluates this, whatever you put inside of this, to be either truthy or falsy anyways. So you don't technically need the Boolean, although you could put it in for extra safety purposes. This will always just be the same thing as not doing it, because within the parentheses of an if, it does that under the hood. And not a number is also a falsy value, but I always forget about not a number, and I don't come across it too often. I believe it happens. I'm not even sure when you are able to get not a number as a value. So we don't have to. It's not a very common thing that happens. It'll definitely, you'll come across it, but yeah, maybe it happens when you try to add a number to a string, but nah, that would just turn that into a string. So if you did like 0 plus s, that would just turn it into a string. Not a number. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look it up, like how we arrive at that, but it can randomly happen, and that will be falsy. And Boolean of false is also false. So those are all falsy values. And so let's figure out what this exclamation point operator is all about. So the exclamation operator coerces a value to a Boolean value that's opposite of its actual value. So it's called the not operator. And basically what it does is it does the opposite of what that value evaluates to. So when you do not true, that means it's false. When you do not a string, that becomes false too, because a string normally is true. And so this will evaluate to false. And sometimes, the reason why that would be useful is if you had a function like function is odd, right? And this function just takes a number and it tells you if return x modulo 2 equals 1, which basically means remainder. So this is going to return true or false. So sometimes you'd want to say, oh, if not is odd, which basically means if it's even. So there are times where you'll want to use this not variable, because you want to check the opposite of what you want to assert, the opposite, essentially. Then we'll console log like x is even or something. So we'll do like var x equals 1 or x equals 2, and this should log its x2 is even, because it goes into this, because this not is converting this is odd is essentially going to become an is even function because it's not odd. I'm asserting that it's not odd. And if we don't have an is even function, then doing not is odd is pretty much the same thing as an is even function. So going over all these, not 100, that basically means it's false, because the Boolean value of 100 is true, and so not 100 will become false. And then when we do not an array of any length, because even an empty array is still truthy. So when we do not an array of any length, that becomes false. And not an object also becomes false. So double, I don't use this frequently, but this basically does the same thing as Boolean. I think it's just another way to use the Boolean. If you don't want, I guess it's a shortcut because you don't want to type out Boolean, then you can use double not, and that'll convert that value to a Boolean value. So yeah, it just becomes all true because you're converting it to be a Boolean. You're casting it. You're changing the type of that data from whatever it was to be a Boolean. Yeah, we'll learn some logical operators. Basically, double ampersand means all of those, basically it returns the first falsy value or the last value if all are truthy. So yeah, like 10 and apples and 0 and null will return 0 because it returns the first falsy value and 0 is falsy. This line 7, we can try and calculate it, but it should return 7 because they're all truthy. So it'll just return the last. It'll evaluate to the last value, and so that'll become the value of return value. So return value would be 7, and then in line 4, return value 1 would be 0 because it's not the last one, but it's the first falsy occurrence. So we get 0 and 7. So yeah, you can also use this. I mean, you can use this for this kind of thing where you're assigning something and you wanted to assign it to the first falsy value. But it's also commonly done in if statements just as a logical and. So, you know, if a number, so let's do some other logical operators. So if the weather is sunny and it's just like making the criteria more stringent, saying that there needs to be all these different cases for you to do something. So if the weather is sunny and my mood is happy, then you know, I'll go to the beach or something. I'll run that function. And now this is going to fail because I need to define what weather is and mood is. But this is the general idea, is what this and double and is used for, is basically saying like these two conditions have to both be true for me to go to the beach. Also, the way that we just saw it used was we're saying, let me try to think of an example that makes sense. The first falsy value. So like, var, it's hard to think of this case that they were kind of going over where it returns the first falsy value or the last value. Yeah, it's hard to think of an example that's not contrived for this one, but yeah, it's more commonly used like this in terms of like creating a more stringent case for your ifs, you know, and you could even be even more picky. Like in order for you to go to the beach, it needs to be sunny, you need to be happy, and it needs to be Saturday or something. So there, and it may even be another and, but in the case where, there are cases where you'd want to use this double ampersand like this in terms of assignment and assigning it to the first null falsy value, but I just can't think of a good example off the top of my head that isn't contrived like this, because this doesn't really make any sense. But this is also how logical operators work with assignments. So now we learned about ands. We could now learn about a cousin of and, which is or, and that is using these two lines. And basically, it just makes you less picky. So you could just replace all these with ors, and that'll mean that, only one of them has to be true for you to want to go to the beach. So it's more carefree person that always likes going to the beach. They just need an excuse. Like, it's like you're literally just trying to find an excuse to go to the beach. So, you use this or, in which case, if any of these are true, then you'll run this function. And in this case, it'll return the first truthy value. So it's the opposite. When you use and in assignments, it'll return the first falsy value. But if you use or, then it'll return the first truthy value. So this will become happy because, and this is more common. This is more commonly used because you're asserting all these things and you want to pick the first truthy value. And so I think it's easier to think of an example here where, you come across your first truthy and then you pick that. So return value is going to be happy in this case. And here return value is going to be not a number because they're all, I believe 10 is less than 0. Oh, this is false. This will evaluate to false. So they're all falsy until we get to NaN, which is also falsy, but it happens to be the last one. So it'll be the one that gets assigned to this variable. And this one's pretty more commonly used, like, let's say var name equals, nickname, if it exists, or your, or let's just say we'll call your name your, official name, or if your official name doesn't exist, then we'll call you by your nickname, or if you also don't have a nickname, then we'll call you by your ID. And if you also don't have an ID, then we'll call you droid or something. So this is a more common, like, non-contrived example where you're saying, oh, does your official name exist? Well, right now it'll be false because this doesn't exist because we've never even defined official name. So if we need to do something like official name is David Coe. That's my official name. So now when I console log name, it'll be name David Coe because, dang, this is spaced weird. But because I have an official name, it'll be David Coe. But if I took this out, if you guys want to make a guess, it would be droid because none of these exist. So, well, I guess we're running into an error because they're all not defined. So we need to define them at least. So var official name. var nickname, var ID. So now it'll be droid because these are all undefined. So it defaults to the last thing because this is false, this is false, this is false, and this is truth. And this is actually true. So it not only defaults to it because it's true, but it also defaults to it because it's the last item. So for two reasons, the name is droid, because these are all undefined. Since I haven't set a value to these variable declarations yet, they automatically become an undefined value, and undefined evaluates to false when we use logical operators. So yeah, that is pretty much, I believe that's it for today. Yeah, it's the last slide. So yeah, I'm gonna open up. Feel free to ask any questions again, ping me, ask it out loud. But we're gonna go through the next set of exercises, and then we'll have one more lecture tomorrow on JavaScript. I believe it's going to be on, I'm not sure what it's on actually. Let me check what the last topics are. I believe it's going to be on